Well, let's continue that conversation. Tebeke and Toby speaking there. There are so many different ways to look at this. Herman Pretorius is Director of Communications for the Institute of Race Relations. Herman, good afternoon to you, and appreciate you making yourself available for us again this afternoon. You'd have heard Tebeke and Toby making the point about the role of the British state during what were known in some cases as the frontier wars, that other names, in the Eastern Cape in the middle of the 1800s. In a way, there's a bit of a commonality with how other people might feel. I'm talking specifically about people of the Afrikaans heritage during the First and then particularly the Second Anglo-Boer or South African War, as it's now often known. And people would talk about, the concentration camps during that time. There's quite a commonality in terms of the British colonial experience.
Yes, no, absolutely. I do think that the brutality of colonialism is a topic well worth discussing and discussed quite often. I do think, however, one should be careful not to ascribe 21st century mores to 20th century monarch on the responsibility of a 19th century war. History is a complex thing, and I do, I'm as the descendant of people who actually fought in the Anglo-Boer War and had family members who experienced those concentration camps. One wouldn't want to gloss over the evils of imperialism, but I do think it is always dangerous to judge history by the standards of current morality.
Well, there'll be people who will agree with you, Herman, and people who disagree with you. I was making the point, speaking to an earlier guest, that one of the most powerful cultural aspects in terms of the cultural power in the English-speaking world is that no matter where in the English-speaking world you would go, and by definition almost the English-speaking world has had a big British impact on its history, people will talk about the Queen, and they won't be talking about anyone but the Queen whom Britain is laying to rest today. That is an immense cultural power. You define yourself as the Queen. I don't think anyone else has had that kind of cultural power that I can think of, maybe in the last 100 years.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think even a further testament to the fact of the lingering British presence and legacy is that we are conducting this conversation in the language of the British Empire. That most of our laws, our constitution in South Africa, the sort of authoritative manifestation of such laws is in the English language. And it's one of those serendipitous consequences of history where up until relatively recently, the idea of military conquest giving rise to legitimate government, that was an accepted fact of history. The idea that nations have a right not to be invaded, not to be conquered, is actually quite a new phenomenon that one could perhaps trace to the coming into being of the League of Nations, ironically a brainchild of Jan Smuts, ironically made possible by the British Empire itself. So history is a pitfall of happenstance and happy coincidence and tragic coincidence quite often. And if there's one thing that one should be hesitant to do is to too easily cast judgment on the legitimacy, the villains, the heroes of history. And sometimes we talk about colonial wars as if there were no wars prior to colonial wars. No, it was just a different set of wars in a different era with a different purpose. War and conquest and territorial conquest is as old as time, and actually up until relatively recently in human history was something that everyone accepted as brutal and as bloody as it might be.
There's so many different ways to look at how the world has changed over the last 70 years. Now, I'd suggest that, again, to go back to Smuts, the preamble to the United Nations Charter, the inclusion of human rights. Ironically, he was heading a state that wasn't quite an apartheid state, but certainly it was racist and exclusionary. There are all sorts of ironies to all of this, as you well know, Herman. But it's interesting to see how the world has changed since then. And in a way, Britain's Queen Elizabeth II was reigning over all of those changes from really the end of the Second World War. Britain came out of that weaker than it had been, and in a sense has sort of declined. I mean, in the last 10 years, I would suggest even Britain's influence in southern Africa has declined really quite dramatically for all sorts of complicated reasons.
Absolutely, and it is happening today that one can, without going to, as the Afrikaner might say, fetching the baboon behind the hill, could legitimately connect to the early 1600s when the naval dominance of England and then later Britain started to assert itself, giving rise to the colonial era, then later the scramble for Africa, and then into the First World War, where essentially empire came to a dead halt. And then it took another world war to expose the fractiousness of this geopolitical global setup to such a degree that the demands, primarily firstly coming from India for independence, became an unmovable momentum that snowballed into the great republicanization of the third world, the former colonial world. And here we are today in a country defined by one ethnic group, one cultural group, or group's reaction to the collapse of empire. And that's, of course, the Afrikaner dominated by national party politics, where apartheid can be seen as a decolonialist exercise, but I don't think an exercise that anyone would really want to endorse now. So the interest of looking at this current of history and then going all the way to perhaps Robert Mugabe being quite close to the British government throughout his time, or at least up until the early 2000s, and then that relationship soured immensely. And one might even see Mugabe's relationship with the British government as the real turning point, perhaps not in the last 10 years, but definitely in the last 20 years, of when sub-Saharan Africa and the British government really started taking very different paths.
There's another conversation that's worth just having about 21st century states and governance, which is that you have all of the sort of formal things, a constitution in our case, a president. You also have what I would call sort of informal leaders, again, this sort of issue of cultural power. So in Britain you had, in a strange way, the monarchy lends a legitimacy to certain things, and that's quite important. It gives a legitimacy to Parliament, and Parliament, their Parliament, perhaps the House of Commons, a legitimacy to the monarchy. These dynamics go both ways. I mean, I would argue that we also have our own leaders who are not necessarily formally powerful, but have a cultural power all of their own. And I think you see this in many places. In Boston, for example, in the United States, you would probably want the political support of the Cardinal of Boston, because there's a large population of Catholic people, of the Catholic aspect of Christianity there. In South Africa, I think you wouldn't want to sort of go to KwaZulu-Natal against the wishes of the king of the Amazulu people. It's so interesting to sort of compare and contrast the different ways in which people have a form of cultural power. I'd suggest most societies have people like this. And in Russia, I think the head of the Greek Orthodox Church there, for example.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's why the conversation about why monarchy is always one that sort of piques my interest, because in a way one wants to answer why not monarchy. Every nation, every society, every community is going to have some sort of constitutional symbolism around which it seeks to establish unity. In South Africa, we have a national crest, the coat of arms. We have the flag, we have Nkosi Sikelel. We have these shared symbols constitutionally, and the only difference that the Canadians and the Australians and the British have is that their symbol walks and talks and has an added human dimension, which might even be a positive thing. It might be useful to have that a national symbol speak unity at a time of disunity. So I think you're absolutely right. There's no getting away from the influence of power and centers of power. And I think that's why democracy has been a success, because it acknowledges that power lies in a location, whether it's, in the medieval state or the medieval church or the empire. At some point you have to systematize where power is centralized, and democracy in its modern sense is perhaps the best way to guard against illegitimate or unaccountable centralizations of power. But even that, as you note about the Cardinal in Boston, even that can't get rid of the fact that we have these societal anchor points that for reasons of culture, religion or history really carry weight, carry gravitas.
How important is history to all of this? So some institutions in our society have endured through the transition. So, for example, certain religious organizations, the ZCC, I made the example, and it's a useful one, of the king of the Amazulu people. That kingship has endured. In Britain, the monarchy has endured. Now, it suggests that institutions have to endure by possibly doing two things. One is by not changing, and the other is by changing just a little bit, but not too much. In other words, if you don't change, you become irrelevant. If you do change too much, you also become irrelevant.
Yes, I can't remember whether it's Rudyard Kipling, but there's a wonderful line somewhere in a British children's book that says, if you want things to stay the same, things will have to change. And I think that sums up the dance of constitutional monarchy, especially within this world, because you have to be, in terms of the British Constitution, that point of anchor, that point of reference, that commonality, where Elizabeth clearly was everyone's grandmother, in a sense, and yet at the same time, she couldn't go about the way King Edward VII or Victoria went about it. So I think the skill, ultimately, that history will find most present in the reign of Elizabeth II was the ability to change drastically without appearing to shift much. That takes some doing. I think that's quite a coup of diplomatic skill. And it also gives us this idea that we shouldn't look too simplistically at any historical institution, because these historical institutions, if they have survived up to this point, there's a reason for that survival, and perhaps there's something either to learn or unlearn from that example.
Does it also suggest that it would be unwise for King Charles, Britain's King Charles, to make any major differences, that in fact they need to be quite careful about how they actually, what they change and what they stay the same, that for the next little while he maybe should sort of emphasize continuity rather than change?
In the sense that Charles enters into the throne room, as it were, in a sort of very complicated position. He has never been as popular with the British public as his mother has been, especially not since the collapse of his marriage to Diana Spencer. So the goodwill he currently has very much comes from the momentum of the success of his mother's reign. So that's the warning on the one side. On the other, I would make the case that this is probably, looking geopolitically at the whole world, King Charles is probably the man that has the most experience of holding public office, having a relationship with the public, with public servants, having an idea of the functioning of government. Well, in his case, of course, now his government. This is a man who for 73 years has essentially had the most extensive apprenticeship, I think, that any constitutional setup can offer. So I do think he will navigate that with some astuteness. And we see the early inklings of where he might go in that direction. For the last few years, we've heard that he wants a streamlined monarchy. And I think the first significant point of insight as to Charles' approach to the crown would be what kind of coronation within the next year or so is set up for him. It will be at a time of economic crisis. It will be at a time still likely of war on the European continent. And at that point, what will be the line, the needle threaded between pomp and circumstance for the sake of constitutional relevance, continuity, national identity, and perhaps excess that must be guarded against? These two things, I don't think, I, for one, don't really envy Charles that balancing act.
I mean, in a way, one of the issues that we know that he is interested in is climate change, and has been for a long time. And in a way, this may be controversial to say, but it's also an apolitical issue, right? I mean, that would be a really good space for him to be seen to be just very slightly active. Don't push the boat out too far, but just be very slightly active.
I think this is going to be a really difficult one for Charles to navigate, because there is bipartisan, I think, across the world. It's starting to become a bipartisan or multi-partisan issue that the environment is of high importance, and that, whatever degree of remedial policy needs to be proposed. No one, I think, seriously contending for any governance of relevance can make the point that that is a policy area that you just can't look at. But counting in Charles' favor is the fact that he is such a known champion of it. And I think, if I remember correctly from the last few days, he has in fact given the indication that a tree planting campaign that was launched for the celebration of his mother's Platinum Jubilee should continue. And I think that's sort of the safe space to be, where you can, with a wink and a nudge, indicate the priorities of the country. And that gets back to the idea of being a living, breathing national symbol, is to have such a good understanding of your people's priorities that you can embody them, but not dominate or determine them. And Charles has the advantage of his well-known environmentalism. So from this point on, for the rest of his reign, he might not have to say a word, because he might already go down in history as Charles the Green or Charles the Environmentalist, due to his well-known vocal advocacy on this issue over many years.
Certainly more 21st century than Lionheart. Herman Pretorius, thank you, Director of Communications for the Institute of Race Relations, watching this with us. Well,